In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. For the last couple of weeks, we have had readings from the prophet Hosea, where Hosea kind of goes in and tries to frame how God is feeling. And Hosea uses words mostly from family. And so Hosea will talk about God as the jilted spouse, the spouse of an unfaithful person who is just kind of trying to patiently wait for things to come back together again and for things to be good, but at the same time having your heart break at the same time. Then Hosea will talk, like we did last week, about being the parent of kids who could just care less about what the parent is doing for them. Really trying to kind of connect in with people so that they can understand in a very real way what it feels like to have God wanting to be in good relationship with us, but we, either as unfaithful spouse or snotty children, or in this case, a vineyard. Isaiah, this time, heads out into the fields. Heads out into the fields in a way that I think these people would understand. And in an interesting way, and I kind of want to do this a little bit with the sermon, so be kind of ready. Sometimes I'll kind of call on people, but be thinking a little bit about what is God looking for, really looking for from us. Because Isaiah will talk about, let me sing a song. Let me sing you a song of my beloved, who went out. And who is the beloved? It's God. My beloved who went out and planted a vineyard. And having taken Agronomy 101 and 509 at WSU, this person knew exactly how to put that vineyard together. They took enology from the campus over by Walla Walla, and they knew how to grow a vineyard. Anybody here grow grapes? Annette used to. She's not here today. But you really, and interestingly enough, oftentimes grapes need the worst soil, but this person has kind of come in and really wanted to do the right thing. So they got the best piece of land. God got the best piece of land for growing grapes, and pulled out all of the big rocks, and pulled out all of the weeds and everything, and tilled the soil, and put fertilizer down on the soil, and turned it all up, and put in. They went to the co-op and they got the best possible kinds of grapes, the grapevines, planted them, and horror of horrors, what happened? They got stinkberries. Now, I don't know what we have around here that would be an equivalent to like stinkberries. Do we have skunk cabbage around here? Sometimes one of those kinds of things where you're walking by and you just go, oh my gosh, what is that stench? Stinkberries in Palestine, they grow on a vine, so it kind of looks like a grape, and they kind of have like a porcelain berry sort of a thing. But man, do they stink. People have described them as either rot or, as I said with the kids, dog poop. Neither of these kinds of things are things you really want to expect from your vineyard. And then God says, I want you to judge. Folks, judge between me and my vineyard. What more could I have done? And think to yourself, what more could God have done? You see, all the way through, one of the things that really keeps striking me is that as you read the Bible, and as you kind of go through this story of God, what you are doing is continually finding God being the faithful one who is constantly trying to pull us back and trying to kind of remind us and to get us to do what God had meant us to do, the kind of people that God had meant us to be from the start. And it usually doesn't take very long, and kind of things start out fairly well, and then, give it a few generations and it all kind of goes sour, right? And then God has to kind of keep pulling back. Or things happen in the people's lives that really kind of cause them to pull back to center again and go, whoa, what were we doing? What were we thinking? and then we kind of drift off. The time that this piece of Isaiah is being written for was one of the most prosperous times in Israel's history. All of the big kingdoms, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and they're still the same ones. Iraq was Babylon back then, but same thing. Persia was Persia, Iran. They were all kind of in flux. And that meant that Israel could kind of do its own thing. And Israel found itself being a trading partner between all of them. They had 200 years of the best economy. Not kidding. The best economy that they had ever had. They had wealth like they had never had. But the problem is that they got the wealth, and then what started to happen? When you get a little bit of wealth, sometimes you start to think to yourself, well, I'd like a little bit more. And so here's this period of time when you would think that people would be looking upon their lives and going, wow, God has so blessed us. And instead, interestingly enough, they hear a word. They hear a word that says God is looking at them and going, oh, man. What did I step in? It's really a contrary word to what we would have expected. But the kicker is realizing what was happening. Think to yourself, because we do the same darn thing, don't we? Think to yourself about what is it that God is expecting. And it actually says it over and over and over again. And think to yourself how we define Christian. You know, for the most part, a little history lesson here, but it's the same thing that the Israelites did too. That they kind of got obsessed with doing the right thing, the perfect thing. And they also got obsessed with being in control and having religion be in control. We call it theocracy. Luther called it the devil's playground. He said there is nothing worse than having the church in charge of the government or the government in charge of the church. So what happened? Think about our own country. And think about how we got started. A lot of the people that came to the country first, before our Constitution, were Puritans. People that just, okay, a little snotty, but people who just couldn't make it in Europe, or they were just so cranky in a lot of cases that they're, please, we talk about it for Thanksgiving, right? Like, oh, the Pilgrims get on the Mayflower. Well, the Europeans were going, yay, go, please, because you guys are such a pain. You know, the Puritans, for 60 years in England, banned Christmas. They banned it flat out because, after all, Christmas is based on a pagan holiday. What does it mean to be a Christian, you see? And is being a Christian maintaining the purity of who you are and making sure that nothing foreign should come in to your faith? You know, we hear it about Halloween now. Oh, Halloween, that pagan festival. And when Christians were kinder and gentler for the first 300, 400 years of Christianity, when we weren't in charge, Christians would come into a place like Britain and say, oh, I see that you are putting greens up in your house as part of your festivities for the solstice. We can work with that. We'll look at the greens and we'll think of them as the evergreen love of Jesus and the love of God and the cycle of time. And we'll talk about Christmas trees. And we can work with that. You see, but then when we get in charge, then we start to decide who's in, who's out, what's right, what's wrong. And then we start to ban things. Right? And pretty soon being a Christian is not defined by what you do and the positive nature about who you are, but what you don't do. You know, we had the little saying, we don't drink and we don't chew and we're not seen with those who do. It's a very real thing. Think about the things that were banned. Christmas trees themselves, pretty much banned in the United States by religious groups until about the 1850s, 1860s. Can you believe that? That long? I mean, that's not very long. There was a man, a sea captain, who came home after having been at sea for 3 years. This is in Boston. And when his wife opened the door to the house, he kissed her. And he was thrown in jail for 2 months for a public display of affection. Those are the kinds of things that are banned, right? Because they're too... What does it mean to be a Christian? Think about today, how we often, and people will be decrying the fact of, oh, we used to be a Christian nation. Well, how did we define that? How did we define it? Usually it meant that we were in charge, so that we could impose our way of thinking upon everyone else, right? Think about what that means to say Christian, that we want a Christian government, that we want Christian. What's God looking for? Interestingly enough, and I think the word can really work in, is that the word that's used to talk about the smell of stinkberries, I'm back to that again. The word that's used is corruption. Do we realize that when we use that word corruption, what we're talking about is the smell of rot? Are we a country? Are we a people? Are we a church? Are we individuals who are subscribing and forming our lives around what God is actually asking for? Or are we allowing ourselves to subscribe to rot? What is it? What are our values as a people, as a country, as a church? What are our values? God keeps saying over and over and over again that it's not about treading on the heads of the poor. That the value of, this is even 3,000 years ago in Palestine, that those who are aliens in your land should be welcomed into the land and treated as brothers and sisters in the land. 3,000 years ago. Because God says, you knew what it was like. You knew what it was like to be a foreigner. So hold on to that feeling and realize, don't do it to other people. What am I looking for, says God? I planted a vineyard. What's the fruit that I want? I want justice. I want a people who live by justice, which is a word that means fairness, which is a word that means each person who exists has equal value and weight. That every person who is here and every person that we come into contact, every person around the world is equally valuable in the sight of God and should be treated with equal value. That there aren't some people who count for more and some people who count for less. That there aren't some races that are worth more and some races that are worth less. I am looking for justice, says God. And I am looking for righteousness. Which may sound like, ooh, I'm so holy. But righteousness in Hebrew simply means to actually put into practice those things in your life which make you in harmony with God, who is trying to make this world a better place. Let me sing you a song of my vineyard. And you judge. You judge. What is the fruit that you are seeing, says God? I planted a vineyard expecting sweet and wonderful grapes, and instead I got corruption. I may just step back, says God. I may just step back, take down the hedge, and let the foxes run. What is it that we are supposed to be about? All of these things come from the prophets to pull the people back in line again, to remind them of why we're here. And you know, I could not hear that story. I couldn't hear it without thinking that the song that God sang 3,000 years ago is a song that needs to be heard by our ears as well. Let me sing you a song of my vineyard, planted by my beloved. I was expecting justice, fairness, righteousness, goodness, equity, people taking care of one another. And instead, what I smell is rot. Amen.